Hi everyone, Patricia Worby, Alchemy Therapies here, and another in my ongoing series of topics to do with recovery from trauma and how, in fact, trauma is very common and it affects all of us. It's just the degree to which it affects us. I wrote a book called The Scar That Won't Heal about my experience of growing up in a normally dysfunctional family. In other words, I didn't suffer any major abuse of any kind, but we did have a lot of things that happened in my childhood that affected the way I conceptualize threat versus safety. And this makes me more hyper aroused to threat. And it affects everything. It affects the way you function in the world and how you feel and the kinds of relationships you form or not, because you may become aversive to forming relationships. And today I wanted to focus a little on strategies towards attachment wounds or attachment failures, because attachment is the professional psychological name for bonding with usually a caregiver, by which we normally mean parents. But what's really interesting to note is that attachment wounds can be probably the most common form of trauma, as opposed to abusive childhoods, which we do see in therapy, of course, because there are a lot of people who have that kind of trauma. But attachment wounding is so much more common. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And what brought this idea into my head actually was viewing a piece on Dame Vera Lynn, who, if you're watching from outside the UK and don't know who she is, she was a famous singer during the war. She died aged 103. She lived to 103, which is quite incredible. And during the coronavirus lockdown period, she managed to still inspire many people with a message of hope, and the Queen even mentioned her in her speech. So what an amazing thing to get to 103. And it made me wonder, what gives you longevity? What is it about, some people get to 103 and some people die before they're 60. And you might argue that it's diet or it's, lifestyle in some way. Well, of course, that's really important. But I would argue it's also to do with adverse childhood experience, the kind of things that happen to you that don't just change the way your brain feels, but the way that your brain therefore programs the rest of your body. So it's a physiological as well as a psychological issue. And what really struck me looking at the photographs of Vera Lynn was the early photograph of her with her family. And hopefully I'll post the link on the BBC below this talk. Where she is standing in a beautiful triangle above her mother and father. And each of them is touching each other. They have a hand on each other. And it's not sort of, I'm in control of you kind of touch. It's a deeply affectionate touch. And you can see, therefore, the love between all three of them. And she was an only child, so therefore the kind of attachment she had would be very significant, because she wouldn't have had any siblings to be a rival, to distract from that. And so if the relationship between her parents was dysfunctional, or the relationship between her and one of her parents was dysfunctional, it would likely have not meant that she became as successful as she was so early on, because she hit success by the age of 22, which can be very damaging for some people without that kind of very strong bond, and they end up being overwhelmed and become addicts and die young. We've seen that a lot. I've even done talks on that. So it really struck me that attachment is obviously key to long life and living well. And so I realized I hadn't done a lot on attachment wounding and what happens. So attachment wounds occur when there's a failure of attunement or bonding in the early hours, days and months of a baby being born. And there can be a variety of reasons for that. If you've had birth trauma, and your mother has gone through a very difficult time giving birth to you, and maybe you needed help to come out, maybe it was a surgical birth, or you needed some form of, inducement or pulling from the body, either through forceps or ventouse. That can be very distressing to the baby and the mother. It can also be, you know, you're in the wrong position. Perhaps your mother had some form of health problem and, you know, was very distressed around giving birth. Or it may be shortly after birth, if you've had difficulties coming into the world and you need to be separated and put in an ICU because maybe you were premature, or any other problem. If you're separated from your mother in those first hours, that can have a lifelong expression. It actually changes the way your body, your DNA and your body functions. Similarly, if your mum is depressed after you're born, postnatal depression, which can happen due to hormonal changes, that can really affect things. As I've already mentioned, if the relationship between your mother and your father is not that great, or if the father's not around, or there's stress on the mother as she's trying to bring you up, there can be a failure of attunement. In my case, I came into the world quite fast. I had a birthmark on one side of my face, which made it very difficult, I think, for my mum to gaze at me without feeling guilty. And it's all about the expression in the eyes, the mouth. You know, when someone looks at you with love, you understand, you feel that in your body because they crinkle when they look at you. If they're wooden or they're distressed or they're dissociative, so they just can't look at you with love, and I'm sort of doing that now, I'm just sort of going dead in my face to show you what I mean by that. The baby's heart rate actually changes, the baby's face changes to a dead face, you know, an expression of nothingness. And so children develop certain strategies, and this is where attachment comes in. So there might be the first wound, which is you're not safe, you're not in the arms of someone who can meet your needs, and that's this failure of attunement. Then the attachment strategy that you develop in order to make yourself get your needs met is what sort of becomes a default strategy for the rest of your life unless it's addressed. And there are various methods. So without attachment wounding, you're likely to be securely attached, what they call securely attached, and you have no trouble regulating your emotions, and you'll feel able to think and feel at the same time, and you can be fairly confident in who you are and what you want in the world. About 30%, I think it's probably decreasing now, of people are in that category, and they very seldom come into therapy because they really don't need much help. They're usually very secure. However, the remaining two groups, of which there is a subtype, so there's 3 in total, are people who are insecure. And insecure avoidance is the first subgroup. So these people grow up to be very avoidant of their emotions. They think but don't feel. In other words, they find it very difficult to access what they feel about things, but they tend to use words that involve thinking and judgment and analysis. They can be very downbeat, they can be frozen, but they really like to think things through. They're very independent and self-directed, and sometimes uncomfortable with intimacy, and some of them even opt not to have relationships and to be singles because it feels more comfortable to them, because relationships are very challenging for those kinds of people. They can often be confused as to why they're suffering so, because to them everything seems very clear. It's you that has the problem, you know, the person that tries to relate to an avoidant. And because they have no internal model of their own needs, they often dismiss their needs, and sometimes we call them dismissive adults. And so they often don't like to be beholden to others. They don't like to ask for what they want. They tend towards intellectualization as well. So they although they yearn for closeness, they can't ask for it, and they feel very, very uncomfortable. And in therapy, these people are often very difficult to engage with emotions. So we have to work with thinking and analysis. And so CBT might be a very good approach for these people. But I also try and encourage them to imagine, because their imaginations are actually quite strong, but they haven't been exercised. And so I get them to maybe see themselves in a new way and imagine a better outcome. And your job really is to enable them to gently access their feelings as well as their thoughts. And body-based methods can be very powerful for that. So singing, chanting, yoga, anything that involves accessing internal sensation. And then we have the insecure, ambivalent or anxious people. They're the ones that always seek reassurance. They often worry about relationships and how they're going. They're often very hyper aroused and anxious, and find it difficult to distinguish safety within relationships. So they don't always discern well, they don't choose well, and they can become very intense when they're involved in relationships, which can upset them, and it can make them liable to codependency, which can sometimes become abusive. So they get very entrenched and enmeshed in relationships, find it hard to get their needs met, even though they're very aware of their needs. They're very difficult to find the right balance because they've got no internal model of a good boundary, so where they end and another person begins. So in therapy, these people will tend to come in and they'll tell you everything. They'll tell you their whole life story. They'll give you loads of information, but it's all about thoughts, and it's all about feelings, but sort of very intense. And your job as a therapist then is to calm that over anxiety with over feeling, and to start give them a reasoning frame, which is hugely helped by being consistent with your own boundaries. So actually saying no when you mean no, and saying yes when you mean yes, and learning to say I don't know if you don't know, but be consistent about it, and always show them that you're there for them when they are anxious, but giving them a good focus for their anxiety by looking at the reality. What is the reality? What is the proof that everyone's against you or nobody likes you? And so getting a more logical frame actually helps these people hugely. Now the third group, or second major group, is the insecure. And for these people, they can't feel or think because they feel totally unsafe all of the time. They tend to come from violent or abusive households. So this is the group that have often been in the mental health environment since fairly young age, will have many diagnoses of borderline personality disorder or ADHD or all sorts of things. Their needs were never consistently met, so they have huge relational issues. They have been routinely shamed or humiliated. They don't have a good inner sense of themselves, and they often take out that feeling of shame on their own bodies by being self-abusive. So they will often have addiction issues with alcohol, drugs, overwork, gambling, self-harm, those sorts of things. Now, if you're going to work with these kinds of people, then you're going to need to know exactly what you're doing. And really, this is a professional job for a professional psychologist or psychiatrist. So, but guiding them to feel safe is the first issue, really. And that's the number one of any trauma work. So really, those are the three subtypes, and all of us tend to show a preference towards that. So I don't know if that was helpful. I hope it was. Maybe if you want more information, do check out my website, alchemytherapies.co.uk, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.